for having me. There's a lot to get through. I'm going to try to get to everything, and then hopefully have some time for questions at the end. And I'll just start with like the broadest overview of what this book is about. There's two arcs to the story, and one is it's this really fascinating Roaring Twenties murder mystery full of larger than life eccentric characters, and then the other arc is about the emergence of the first, America's first tabloid newspapers in New York City, and really the creation of American tabloid culture. And the book is really about how these two stories, have this spectacular collision, and how the country's first tabloid newspaper war really influenced justice in the course of justice in the Hall Mills murder case. And so that's kind of like the big picture elevator pitch for the book, but the basic plot summary, which I want to move through sort of quickly because it's a very complex story. There's a lot of characters, they're hard to keep track of, a lot of weird twists and turns. So I want to try to just boil down the plot for you. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Hall Mills murders, but I'll kind of lay out how they unfold in the book, and then I want to go through a little more in depth with some of the characters. So I'll start. I have some photographic accompaniment for your enjoyment. So this starts September 16th, 1922. It's right as America, plunged into the Roaring Twenties. Two artfully posed corpses were found beneath a crabapple tree, which you see here on a notorious lover's lane right outside of New Brunswick, New Jersey. And if you know New Brunswick, this would be really like right on the border of Franklin and Somerset County, where New Brunswick, way up Easton Avenue, kind of becomes Somerset County. The dead man, his name was Reverend Edward Hall, who was a prominent clergyman whose wife, Frances Hall, was a proud heiress with very illustrious ancestors tied to the Johnson & Johnson dynasty. Of course, the murder of a prominent reverend would have made headlines on its own, and if the murder of a reverend with his prominent wife dead next to him would have been an even bigger story. But the only thing better than that is the murder of a prominent reverend next to his mistress. And it turns out the dead woman was a woman named Eleanor Mills, who was a working class member of the church who sang in the church choir, and her husband happened to be the church sexton. So immediately you could see this as a massive scandal. The story swells to epic proportions, and this scandal-hungry nation is immediately captivated and they devour this voluminous newspaper coverage day after day. So this was a really, truly perplexing murder mystery, and the investigation, it carried on throughout the fall of 1922. But the authorities, they really weren't getting anywhere. They'd sort of botched the initial crime scene investigation in numerous ways. They had no firm suspects or theories. They were following false leads. There was this whole sideshow where they arrested and charged this guy who clearly didn't do it. And they were under immense pressure, not only from the public and the newspapers, but also from the governor of New Jersey, who really wanted this closed up because the whole country was following this circus in New Brunswick, in New Jersey, and you have these investigators who just can't figure it out. So in October of 1922, there's a break, and this mysterious witness comes forward out of the woodwork. She is this theatrical, eccentric woman. She is a pig farmer, literally a pig farmer, and she claimed to be an eyewitness to the murders, who could also place at the scene Frances Hall, the widow, and at least one or both of her brothers, Henry Stevens and William Stevens, and also one of their cousins. And I won't get into the cousin, but if you read the book, you'll meet the cousin. So she comes out with this story, and they do convene a grand jury, mostly based on her testimony. The newspapers coin her the pig woman. She kind of becomes a star of the show. But the grand jury, she didn't convince them. There was no indictments, and at the end of 1922, the whole thing sort of fizzles out. But of course, that's not the end of the story. So in the meantime, this coincided with the emergence of the tabloid newspapers in New York City. The first was the New York Daily News, the first tabloid in America. It still exists today. I'm sure you all know the Daily News. That was in 1919, and that was followed by two more competing early tabloid newspapers. One was called the New York Daily Mirror, which William Randolph Hearst owned. The other was called the New York Evening Graphic. These were the first, with tabloid, we talk of tabloid newspapers, these smaller, more kind of outrageous, down market sort of publications filled with photos and sensational headlines and whatnot. So these were a product of the Roaring Twenties, and they're in this circulation war, and they all have an inkling that if they could revive the Hall Mills case, it'll be great for business. They each take a stab at it, but it was the New York Daily Mirror who was actually finally successful. There was an editor named 𝘕𝘂𝘂𝘂. He started at the Daily News in 1923, and so he started at the Daily News, and in 1923, after overseeing coverage of the Hall Mills case, he tried to bring it back by staging a seance, and they literally tried to scare Eleanor Mills' husband into confessing. They thought maybe he did it if it wasn't the wife, but that didn't work. And then the Evening Graphic, they took a stab at bringing it back in 1924, but finally, 𝘕𝘂𝘂𝘂 got fired from the Daily News, immediately jumped to its main rival, the New York Daily Mirror, and pretty much right away says, I'm gonna revive this case, and he sends his best reporters down to New Brunswick. They do this 8-month investigation, they turn up this new evidence, possibly dubious, maybe not, but it was enough that he basically brought this dossier to the governor of New Jersey and convinced him to reopen the case in the summer of 1926. So this tabloid newspaper, at war with these other tabloid newspapers, basically brings this thing roaring back to life once again. This time there are indictments. The evidence once again points towards Frances Hall and her brothers. They go to trial. The pig woman comes back. Once again, she's the star witness. This becomes an even bigger media spectacle and basically culminates in, probably the biggest courtroom spectacle the country's ever seen, basically the O.J. Simpson trial of its day. And that's kind of like the broad plot arc. Now I want to go through a little more detail on some of the things I just introduced. So this is not actually Edward and Eleanor dead. This is a reenactment, but it's a pretty close approximation of what it looks like when they were found. And I said that they were artfully posed corpses. They were positioned as such as if they were kind of in this affectionate pose, as if they were two lovers sleeping on a lover's lane. You could see like her head resting on his arm, her arms on his thigh. Someone placed his Panama hat over his face. Her eyes were left wide open. What you don't see here, but between the bodies at the crime scene was left a stack of their love letters, and near his left foot there was placed his calling card, which said Reverend Edward Hall. So clearly it was as if someone wanted to know, whoever found them wanted to know who had killed them. It was very gruesome too. He was shot once in the face. She was shot 3 times in the face, and then in addition, you could kind of see she has this model has a scarf on. When the scarf was removed at the crime scene, it was filled with maggots, and her neck had essentially been sliced ear to ear, so much so that there was only about 4 inches of skin left in the back. She was nearly decapitated. So it was and at the same time, their clothing was like very neatly arranged. Someone went through a lot of trouble to stage the bodies in this way. And the crime scene itself, right from the get-go, this is not a picture of the crime scene on the day the bodies were found, but crowds ascended right away. They police couldn't keep them back. They trampled over evidence. They're picking things up. They didn't take any photos of the scene. It was pretty much like, even by the standards of 1922, contaminated right away. And from the very beginning, this became like this morbid tourist attraction. So this picture, I don't know exactly when it was taken, but it would have been that fall. And throughout the fall, people from all over, from different states, they came far and wide to see the site of this murder that the whole country was talking about. And to the point where this is the tree that I showed you, that was a photo that I believe was probably taken like the day after the bodies were found. People came and they like stripped all the branches away because they wanted souvenirs, and it basically became like this stick. And here's a picture of people at some point that fall, they're like stripping bark away. There's nothing left, but they want to take a piece of this murder with them. So it really just shows how much this was something that captivated the country and was really like a form of kind of twisted entertainment for people at the time. So here we have our victims, Edward and Eleanor. Though their spouses, denied any, they couldn't imagine why they were out together on a lonely lover's lane, and what they could have been doing there. Pretty much within the church, St. John the Evangelist, which this is the picture of it back then, it was covered in ivy. Now it's kind of just looks the same, except for there's no more ivy. This was a church. It was a very close-knit community. There was very prominent residents who attended. There was, more poorer residents. They all kind of mingled in the church, and the choir was kind of like the center of everything. Eleanor was very devoted to the choir, and was a member of his inner circle. And they were known to pass like love letters to the inside of the church. They would pass, notes back and forth in a hymnal, or they had a book, a certain book on his study where they would kind of exchange love notes. And even, they were just very close. But members of the choir, they had seen them like in New York together. There was just lots of gossip that was festering. That it was very clear that people knew that something was going on between them. And as it came out, of course, they're murdered. Their love letters are discovered. They had kept secret love diaries for one another while he was on vacation a few weeks earlier. Clearly, this was kind of like the worst kept secret that these two people were having this affair. But again, their spouses kind of denied it. Pretty much, Frances Hall certainly, almost to the very end when she was on trial, denied that they had any awareness that they were anything more than close church colleagues. This is the very first newspaper report about the murder. So this is the Daily Home News. Today you would probably know it as the Home News Tribune, which is a sister paper to the Asbury Park Press these days here. Back then it was called the Daily Home News. It was just for New Brunswick. They were the first reporters on the scene were from the Daily Home News, but immediately that same day, all of the big New York papers, and there was like 10 of them at the time, morning papers, evening papers, they were all over this. So were other papers from all over the country. It really was a media spectacle. But this is like the very first, so you can see how if you're a local person at the time, you see Episcopal Reverend Rector shot to death with woman in lonely place near city. But this is just, you can see how this was just the stuff that like salacious newspaper coverage was made of. This is Eleanor. She came from working class immigrant German family. She was one of like 11 siblings. They lived in cramped quarters. Growing up, didn't have much, but she was smart, and she had ambitions and aspirations to make something of herself. She was well read. She read a lot of romance novels, but she did read and dreamt of faraway places that she wanted to visit and things like that. She didn't graduate high school because she married Jim Mills at the age of 17, and 7 months later they had a child, not 9. So clearly it was a shotgun wedding. He was much older than her. He was 28 at the time, and basically all her dreams kind of faded to the background, and she became a young mother at the age of 17, and her life's course was sort of set in stone. This is Jim Mills, kind of a sad sack. Again, he was like more than 10 years older than her. He, unlike Eleanor, was just kind of content with this life of hard work and toil. They did have a second child named Daniel, who's not so relevant to the story. And this family of 4, this is Charlotte. This is the daughter, Charlotte. She was a great character, actually, because she was like this vivacious flapper. She adapted the flapper lifestyle at the time, even though they didn't have a lot of money. She kind of tried to look the part, and she called herself a flapper, and she really was spunky and very bold. The newspapers loved her because she would give these juicy quotes, and at one point she even early on wrote a letter to the governor of New Jersey that maybe was like encouraged by the newspaper reporters, but she basically like pled for help, and they printed it in the newspaper, and it ginned the story up even more. So she was really like seeking justice from her mother, who she was very close to. They weren't like so far apart in age. She would have been 16-ish at the time. Eleanor was probably 34, I think. So they kind of almost had more of like a sisterly sort of relationship, and she was very devastated by her mother's death and really, wanted to find out who killed her. So this family of 4 lived in this house. It still stands today. They lived on the upper 2 floors, kind of the top floor in the attic, a 4-room apartment. It's leaky. Jim kind of like supports the family on 2 jobs, working as a janitor at an elementary school, and then also as the sexton of the church, which is a job that the Reverend Edward Hall actually got him. And these 2 families, though one was like extremely wealthy and one was poor, they did have social interaction as church colleagues. Reverend Hall visited their home, which wouldn't have been unusual because he would make house calls and such. Eleanor would go to the Hall mansion up literally, a few blocks away and, take flowers from their garden and things like that. So the families were, kind of, they had this like kind of curious relationship, not curious, but they had this kind of, relationship as church colleagues, though not social equals, and these kind of like, these two different worlds that were just a few blocks away, one of wealth and privilege and one of hardship. This is Phil Payne, the tabloid editor character I mentioned. He's a very significant character in the book. He grew up in his early childhood in Canada outside of Toronto, but then moved probably around age 12 or so to Perth Amboy, which is really where he grew up. He was a sportsman, he loved sports, was involved in all the local basketball and baseball teams. And then, early on after he finished high school in Perth Amboy, he got a job at the local Perth Amboy paper, like covering sports. And from there, he embarked on this, really successful journalism career. He moved north to Hudson County and got a job working for a Hudson County newspaper, which is a bigger job right across the river from New York. He tried to go to war during World War II, but he had, as you can see, he was like kind of nearly blind. He was deaf in one ear. He actually like tried to get sent there to fight in the war, but they wouldn't let him go. So he joined the Knights of Columbus War News Service and was basically like a correspondent for the Allies and wrote newspaper copy. But he came back. He got a job at the Daily News. That was his big break in 1919. Just literally a few weeks before the Hall Mills murders broke, he was named managing editor of the newspaper, the top job in the paper. So he has the number one job at this newspaper that's kind of come out of nowhere, this new tabloid form that's really challenging all the other legacy press, and suddenly he has this huge story on his hands that is gonna really help his newspaper and all the other newspapers. This is the Daily News. This is some of its coverage of the murder case. Now, this was at the time the only tabloid newspaper. No other, Hearst hadn't started the Mirror, the Evening Graphic wasn't around, there was none in other cities yet. And this just gives you a sense of like no other newspaper looks like this. All the other broadsheet newspapers would have just been like maybe some photos, but just like a sea of text. And you could see how the Daily News, they were having fun with this story. They were throwing these enormous photos on the front page, really like making this a story about these larger than life characters that you could see. And I mean, this just like makes you want to buy this newspaper. And they're really, they're creating entertainment in a way that newspapers hadn't up until this point. So I just wanted to give a taste of what, this coverage was like at the time and why it was so different than anything newspaper readers would have seen. This is the Daily Mirror. This on the left, this is like, when they blew open the story, this is the front page that did it. Hall Mills murder mystery bare. This case had not really been in the public imagination for a few years, and all of a sudden they had this exclusive, like that was bringing the case back, and that, this is the issue that essentially did it, and is the reason there was a trial, and it became as big of a story as it did. And even you can see, like, even by today's standards of tabloid newspapers, this is pretty lurid stuff. Like, they're commissioning this artwork, and they're putting Francis Hall at the murder scene. So this was pretty outrageous. And even today, these tabloid newspapers by today's standards were very lurid, if not even more so than what would pass in newspapers today. So I just wanted to give a taste of like what this sort of coverage looked like. And then you can see this is Jim Mills and Charlotte Mills, the flapper and the cuckolded widower, and they're reading the Daily Mirror because the Daily Mirror really championed like their side of the story, because when it brought the case back again, all the evidence they had was pointing towards Frances Hall and her brothers. And you can see how the Mirror took this publicity shot of them reading the coverage, and they sort of were allied with, they saw themselves as kind of, I think, allied with the Daily Mirror because it was really championing justice for her mother and for his dead spouse who was cheating on him, but nonetheless, I think he wanted to figure out who he killed her. This is the star witness, Jane Gibson, the pig woman. She has a really convoluted backstory that is probably, she was kind of like, not a grifter, but she was a teller of tall tales, and the story she told to the newspapers about this life where she had run away from home and been a bareback rider in the circus and all this stuff, like it all turned out to probably be not true. And as the prosecution and newspapers started digging into her past. This totally different, more mundane story emerged. Her last name wasn't even Gibson. She had like different husbands. It was just kind of crazy. And the point is that it kind of undermined her credibility as a witness, and yet she was the eyewitness, and she was who the prosecution, both in 1922 and 1926, really pinned all their hopes on. But she became like, as much as all the people that were involved in the case itself, I mean, she became like a star of the newspaper coverage. They just loved her. Scott Fitzgerald, like, was in it. He made reference to her in an interview at the time, like, just to give you a sense that, you know, these people essentially became national celebrities, to the point that even real national celebrities were paying attention and following the twists and turns of this story. This is Edward Hall in the center, obviously, with women at the church. And I don't know, I think this might have been either Asbury Park or Point Pleasant. They did take church trips to Point Pleasant. There's a scene in the book where they take this church outing to Point Pleasant, and I'm not sure where this one was taken, but he grew up working class in Brooklyn, New York. He entered Grace Church choir school as a choir boy at a young age. So he got this sort of elite Episcopal education, and then he continued on into the seminary, the Episcopal Seminary in New York. And he graduated, he came out, he ended up eventually at New Brunswick, St. John the Evangelist in 1909. He was 28. He was considered a handsome guy, but he was also a very charismatic individual. And immediately when he came into the church, all the parishioners were drawn to him, especially the women, as you can see. And he could have like had his pick of the congregation, probably, this charismatic single man coming into the church. And there was a younger woman who was his age, who very beautiful, who he was apparently courting, but then mysteriously out of nowhere, he becomes engaged to Frances Hall instead, who was 7 years older than him and not so beautiful, and basically may have ended up a spinster, but somehow this marriage comes about, and you know, we don't know the provenance of their relationship or courtship, but it would not strain credulity to think that, you know, he was definitely advancing himself by marrying into this very wealthy family. Frances Hall, she, you know, just to give a sense, she's practically like, not like a Mayflower family, but pretty close. Her ancestors on her father's side go back to like the Revolutionary period. She had a great grandfather named Ebenezer Stevens who fought in the Revolutionary War. He corresponded with the founding fathers. She was distantly related to Edith Wharton through him. And on her mother's side, she came from this prominent, more like financial family of this merchant class sort of family who ended up in New Brunswick in the 19th century and established a very successful wallpaper business. They did a real estate deal with Johnson & Johnson, like leasing their headquarters out to them, which became the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. And she had some cousins who married into the Johnson family. Very, you know, Victorian, haughty, proud, illustrious woman. So like scandal, affairs, murder, this is all, the publicity, this is all anathema to her, and she finds herself basically in this nightmare. And you know, granted, she becomes a suspect as well. We don't know if she did it or not, but for a woman of her stature and kind of like Victorian sensibility, this was the worst thing in the world that could probably happen to her. She had two brothers. One of them was Willie Stevens. I'll show you him next. But they lived together, and as well with Edward Hall. This is what their mansion looked like in 1922. It's a kind of old, creepy Victorian mansion. It's still around today. I'll show you a picture of that later on. But she was very close to her brother Willie. He was a bachelor. He was a curious fellow. You may think he was a firefighter, but he actually was just a grown man who was obsessed with firefighters. He hung out at the firehouse. He was like an honorary firefighter. He would cook them food, and he was kind of like comic relief to them. He had these childish sensibilities, even though he was a grown man. He couldn't be relied on to keep track of his own finances. So while Frances and her brothers had all inherited this fortune from her mother when she died, his was set in this trust, and he kind of got this meager weekly allowance that Reverend Hall actually was said to have controlled, which may have been a sore spot in their relationship. But he was a very even though he had these kind of childlike tendencies, he was clearly a very smart man. He sat in his room smoking a pipe, reading the newspapers. He had all these brainy books on metallurgy and botany, and so we don't know, we can't make a diagnosis of his psychological state today. It's possible he had some, might have fallen on the autism spectrum. He was kind of savant-like, but he was another really rich, eccentric character in this whole thing. And he finds himself with his sister, accused and on trial, and their other brother, who I usually don't talk about too much, but I want to talk about today because he really has local relevance. His name is Henry Stephens, and he lived in 𝘂𝘂𝘂. So Henry Stephens, I'll actually read a passage from the book just to introduce Henry to you. There we go. A graduate of Rutgers College, Henry had gone into the arms and ammunition trade after working as an engineer for a bridge company. His job involved going out on the road for the Remington Arms and demonstrating shotguns. Later in his career, he operated a shooting school at Atlantic City's $1 Million Pier. Henry had retired from the arms business in 1920, but his home in 𝘂𝘂𝘂, a toothpick of a town separating the Atlantic Ocean from Barnegat Bay, boasted a gunroom. Henry was a consummate outdoorsman, 5'8" with a ruddy face, thick graying hair, and a black mustache, not quite as robust as his younger brothers. Henry and his New England-bred wife, Ethel, enjoyed their quiet life at the beach with Henry's 18-foot boat. They'd recently given up a Manhattan apartment in order to live year-round in their 12-room oceanfront colonial. It was the largest house in 𝘂𝘂𝘂, filled with brass lamps and expensive paintings and the smell of burning driftwood, as well as books on astronomy, birding, and hunting. Henry was fond of trap shooting, but he said it had been nearly 20 years since he'd fired an ordinary revolver, and he swore he'd never fired an automatic, the weapon believed to have killed his brother-in-law. Henry's alibi placed him about 50 miles southeast of the murder scene on the beach in 𝘂𝘂𝘂. He was fishing there until 10:30 with several other locals who could vouch for his whereabouts. 2 days later, on Saturday afternoon, he'd barely gotten the line out when a station agent from town approached him on the boardwalk and placed a telegram in his hand. It was from Henry's cousin, Edwin Carpenter. It said, "Edward has been killed." So this notion, so Henry's alibi, which is not a huge plot point in the book, but it is significant. And he claimed there was 10 guys who could have seen him on the beach the night when the murders occurred. And this became a significant point in 1926 when this thing was going to trial finally. He had said he had given the authorities 4 years earlier the names of 10 men who he claimed were with him that night when he was fishing. And crucially, he said that he had recorded in a diary the catching of this bluefish by a man named Arthur Applegate. I only just learned before coming here that apparently the Applegate family is this very eminent local Ocean County clan. So this guy named Arthur Applegate had caught a bluefish, and Henry took it and he went back and weighed it in his garage with Arthur Applegate, and he even recorded it in his diary. And that was how he said, this can prove I was not in New Brunswick on the night of the murders. So once the prosecutor in 1926 started looking at Francis and her brothers more closely, he goes back down to 𝘂𝘂𝘂. I think he actually went to Tom's River. He did some interviews in Tom's River with some of these men who Henry had claimed on the beach with him that night. And all of a sudden, these men are saying, I can't remember if it was definitely September 14th. Maybe the detectives suggested that date to me, or the newspapers did. And all of a sudden, Henry's alibi, is starting to look a lot more shaky. And they cannot, some of them don't remember the bluefish, but Henry swears, he maintains it was all true. And when they actually go to trial, and after telling the prosecutor that, we actually can't say for sure that we saw him that night, the 14th. He was fishing lots of nights on 𝘂𝘂𝘂. He was always out on the beach. Sure enough, at trial, all of a sudden, those statements were given in error. We definitely did remember Henry. And you have to remember that this family was very prominent. They were well connected, and it could have been in people's interest to not go up against them, or to we don't know for sure if these people were lying or what. But suddenly their testimony about Henry changed at the trial, and the prosecution wasn't able to break his alibi down the way they had hoped. But that wasn't even one of the most significant pieces of evidence. Much more significant is what you see here. This is a picture of the actual calling card that I mentioned that was found near the Reverend's foot. There's fingerprints on here. This card went missing, but at some point between 1922 and 1926, it had fallen into the hands of some fingerprint expert in Newark who had assisted with the investigation or whatnot. When it was doing its newspaper investigation, the Daily Mirror tracked this card down, and they looked at these fingerprints, and they found an expert who compared them to the fingerprints of Willie Stevens, the other brother, and this expert claimed that there was, I think, 5 or 6 they call ridge characteristics that meant the fingerprints were a match. So basically, the Mirror, they put it literally on their front page, showing that this fingerprint found on the card is a match to the fingerprint of Willie Stevens. So this was a pretty crucial piece of evidence in the trial, which involved testimony from fingerprint experts, which then, as it would probably still be today, is very arcane and complex and hard to understand. But whether or not this really was a genuine fingerprint of Willie Stevens was one of the questions the jury had to contend with. And again, just to show you how much this tabloid newspaper was inserting itself into the investigation, this gives you a pretty good sense of that too. But once again, it is the pig woman who really is the star of the show. By 1926, when this is at trial, which again, this is a trial where there was something like 300 journalists were descended on Somerville from all over the country to cover it. It was standing room only in the courtroom all day, people outside the courtroom, it was a total circus in Somerville, New Jersey, where this trial was held. All the local hotels are booked up with reporters, newspapers renting out whole houses. And the pig woman, she had fallen ill by then. She died of cancer. And at this time, she probably had some combination of cancer and a blood infection and just whatever was going on with her. They thought she might actually not make it. And she was taken to a hospital in Jersey City because the governor and the authorities were all part of the Jersey City Democratic machine. And they were the ones who took over this investigation for the state in 1926. But in a very dramatic display, she was taken by ambulance from the hospital in Jersey City and in a 4-hour procession to the courthouse in Somerville, which was followed along the route like a parade. People were there's the pig woman, and she's wheeled in to the courtroom on a hospital bed, and she testifies almost at a whisper. They had to, have the court stenographer read back her comments to the jury to make sure they could hear her. But she tells her story once again of this account that she, where she claimed to have seen the murders take place. It's kind of a wild story. She claimed that she was out at night on her mule, one of her mules. It's a mule she called Jenny. It was her favorite mule, and she thought someone was stealing her corn, so she was following this wagon, at 10 p.m. at night, and then she stumbles upon this murder scene. Her story had changed at different times, details were shifting this way and that. So it really was, she was really not a great witness between her kind of checkered past, which had a lot of discrepancies, and her story not really staying exactly the same all the way through. But again, for whatever reason, the prosecution kind of makes her the center of their case, and she testifies before the jury, with the defense seeing just rip her to shreds, and they bring out, they just cut through, her past and show all these examples of her lying or not being truthful and not even going by the real last name that she had. So, as the person that was probably supposed to be the slam dunk for the prosecution, it had the opposite effect. And, this is not too much of a spoiler to say that this case remains unsolved to this day, and that the defendants were acquitted in this trial. But again, I will leave one final twist for you, and I hope you all will pick up the book and read it. But years later, in 1969, another mysterious witness did emerge with another story that kind of brought the case back to life once again. And there was a third investigation in 1970. This is from this detective magazine from 1970 when this kind of came back in a way in the media. And I will leave you to read the book to find out what happens there. And I think that after reading the book, you might be able to form your own conclusion about who you think did it, and if you do think Frances Hall and her brothers were responsible. But before we get to questions, I want to just go through a few more fun slides I have that I could show you. So this is like, I believe I took this in 2019 when I was researching. This is a display case. I think it's probably still there at the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville, but they have on display, this is the famous Panama hat that was placed over his face at the murder scene. Those are the shoes the Reverend was wearing. Those are the shoes that Eleanor Mills was wearing when she was murdered. It appears to be a portion of one of the love notes, her scarf. So basically some physical artifacts from the case, but there are many more physical artifacts from the case, not on display, that I was allowed at one point early on in my research to go into the prosecutor's office and spend a day going through the actual physical evidence that still exists from the case. So these are Edward Hall's eyeglasses that he was wearing when he was killed. These are the stockings that Eleanor Mills was murdered in. I was able to hold these, which is very, very strange and eerie feeling. But these are the pig lady's keys, Jane Gibson's keys to her farm. This is one of her day calendars, which was also a crucial piece of evidence in the case. So they still have a lot of the physical evidence from the case on file. It's not open to the public, unfortunately, but it is very thrilling to handle it if you're lucky enough to have the chance, like I was. This is St. John the Evangelist today. This was just taken in May 2022, actually. I had a friend who lives in New Brunswick run down there and take some photos because I was on deadline to get the photos done for the book. The church looks pretty much today like it did back then. Anyone could go in. There was an amazing, there's a theater group in New Brunswick who did this amazing play about the Hall Mills murders, and they actually staged it inside the church. And it was like, it was really wild to be inside the church, watching the story come to life in the very place where all this intrigue had, unfolded 100 years earlier. This is what the mansion, Frances Hall's mansion, looks like today. She had it redone in 1925. So pretty much just a few months before this case came back to life, she had done this top to bottom renovation of her mansion, which she turned from this, kind of old, creepy Victorian haunted house into this more modern looking house. I think we say mansion, by today's standards, it doesn't look too much like a mansion, but it was, everyone called it a mansion back then, and it certainly was very big. This is now, in modern times, this is where the dean of Douglas College, the Women's College of Rutgers, lives. And the current dean was generous enough to let me inside to get a sense of what it was like in the house. And again, it's pretty historically preserved. The furniture obviously is modern, but these are just some of the rooms I was able to walk around in, the staircase, the front door. So, being able to interact with some of this these physical remnants of the crime, go a long way in writing a book like this when you're really trying to bring the story to life and, from the page, transport readers into, where this was taking place at the time. And I hope I did that. Just like shameless plug, if you're interested in my work, you can sign up for my author newsletter. You'll get updates from me, and I also do interviews with other historical narrative nonfiction and historical true crime authors about the research that goes into their books, and some big ones, some good ones. I have David Graham up on there and other great authors. So it's free. You can sign up. I have a notebook there. If you put your email, I'll register you for it. And also the extended paperback edition of Blood and Ink is coming out on December 5th. If you haven't bought it yet, or even if you have bought it, you might want to buy the paperback. There's a new trove of archival material that has surfaced as a result of the book coming out. So there is, I've done an expanded postscript that has some new information that's come to light. So it'll be an expanded edition of the book when the paperback's out December 5th. Otherwise, the hardcover is available from anywhere you want to read it, whether you want to read it from the library or buy it from wherever you buy your books.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.